Hi, I want to continue with the theme of home, the theme of the ambivalence of home that we were talking about last time. Uh, uh, Ultimately, with respect to the political, we're working our way there. Um, Last time, one of the things that I talked about was the way that for the person growing up in the home, the child growing up, the home may or may not start this way, but it can become, and maybe almost always does become, something that feels restrictive. And at a certain point, people, at least certainly in our culture, in Western culture of the 21st century, young people, teenagers, want to get out of the home to a different environment. So this is an image by Jeff Wall. It's called "In Front of a Nightclub" from 2006, and I think it's kind of a helpful image to look at. Um, I imagine if you are a contemporary North American or European, for that matter, or lots of other things, this is a pretty familiar scene. And I think that the reason I wanted to put this one up is, on the one hand, it has people who are relatively young. Some of them could still live at home with their parents. Maybe a lot of them do. Some of them are university age, so maybe they live on their own. There's a couple of people there who could be a bit older. But mostly these are um, relatively young people. So people, in other words, of the sort I was talking about, who presumably have been eager to get outside the home. And I bet, if you just look at the way these people dress, and uh, I don't know if you can see too much smoking of cigarettes and things like that there, but the way these people dress and act, and probably, a lot of them are drunk, um, it's probably not, for most of them, that's probably not the way they would look and act in the family home. For some, maybe. But anyway, I wanted to bring this out first to bring out that contrast, and ideally to get you to remember that sense of the desire to escape home, however much you might feel like you depend on it, and then the sense of where you want to escape to. And so the thing about this is, this is downtown, and so it's an environment that I think has at least two features that are that make it desirable for these people, and the reason you'd want to go there instead of being at home. The first is the biggest one is that basically anybody can go there, right? It doesn't matter which home you come from. This is an environment that doesn't ask who's your mom, right? Or do your parents know you're here? It doesn't care about your home life or where you came from. Anybody can come here, and so that's what in sites of exposure I call an environment of indifference. It's indifferent to those contextualizing conditions of the person, namely their home. It's just like anybody can come. So so here it seems to me one of the things that's really desirable about this is that it is open to anybody, and I guess that word "open" is an important one. It's open to anybody. And then the second thing I would notice about that is that one of the things that comes in taking yourself out of the home environment is that with that openness that you welcome, there is also a little bit of a sense of danger. You don't know who you're going to meet here, and so I think downtown also has a little bit of that dangerous feel, and that can be part of its appeal. So I won't dwell on those points. I think it's worthwhile for you to think about them further. Basically, to try to do a kind of phenomenology of the experience of desiring to go out, desiring to go downtown, that kind of thing. Like what does that actually involve? But I think that's what I've given there is the beginning of an answer. And so and again, the things that I wanted to emphasize then are that it is an environment of indifference. So with respect to that, everybody there is kind of anonymous. You're anybody. So there's a desirability of being just an anybody, and it also is a spot where you go and therefore essentially function as an individual. You don't bring your family with you, and it is characterized then also those very facts mean that it's characterized by a kind of openness, but that openness also brings with it a certain kind of danger because it's an exposure to what is other to you or alien to you without the protective buffering of the home. Um, so there's an image then of what it means to go beyond the home, and what it means for us to establish human environments that create space, a place for, so to speak, housing that desire or aspiration that pretty much anybody could or would have to escape the home, to the extent that the home can start to feel imprisoning or excessively and enclosing. Let me show you another one then. So here, if we go back to that Kai Bott painting that we talked about earlier of a Paris street on a rainy day, that kind of environment of indifference and anonymity and so on is part of what these people are enjoying. And I think I talked about that a little bit before. I remember I was contrasting it with that Jan Steen painting of the happy family or whatever. And you can see that some of the issues that were on my mind there are what I'm picking up on here, if you want to go back. Anyway, the relevant point here is that, like the teenagers at the nightclub, these, established adults are similarly experiencing the desirability of participating in a space that's defined by that kind of indifference. It's open to anyone to be there, and people come out as individuals. I mean, they come out as couples too, but even as couples, like they're two individual people. They're united to each other, but they're not bringing their whole family network with them, right? These are people who, without buffers, are just going out into the public world, and that's kind of what we mean then by public, typically. So I want to point to this as an adult image of the same thing. And they're not going to a nightclub, but what are they doing? Like these people might just be going for a walk, or they might be going shopping. Think about that. Think about the desirability of going out downtown to go buy your stuff, whether it's your groceries or your clothes or whatever. Again, think in terms of why that kind of way of inhabiting space that these people are collectively realizing, collectively bringing about by the way that they inhabit it, right? And they do it in the same way. Think about why that way of collectively inhabiting space might be desirable. And even here, one more. Again, if we go back, we looked at this one before, but the Toulouse-Lautrec of Derrida reading the newspaper. I use this to talk about the experience of the they in Heidegger, which is no doubt relevant because we're talking about the theme of being an anybody and so on. But the thing that I wanted to get at here, without necessarily bringing in those sort of critical connotations that Heidegger was bringing up, I just want you to think about what's involved in reading the newspaper. When you read the newspaper, you are one of all of those people who adopt that kind of world perspective. You, as a single individual, read, right? You can't really read something like this as a group. You sit there by yourself in your chair with a thing that fits the size of your hands, so you can hold it and look at it by yourself. So you have a private experience. It's very much an individual experience. And indeed, newspapers are printed in individual copies. You can imagine a different situation where the town crier or whatever it is comes out and announces the news, and everybody stands around and listens to the one guy announcing the news of the king's new edict or whatever. In that case, you would be participating in a shared experience. It would be a collective activity of going out to hear the news. And as the guy called out the news, like, people might say something back in response, and he'd have to reply to that, or you'd at least hear what your friends think, and you might argue, and the people might say, we're not going to stand for that, and a little revolution might happen on the spot. Who knows, right? This is very different, right? This is not, there's no group reading, right? The whole idea of printing the newspaper in individual copies means individual people do it, right? And so that's something that happened basically after the invention of the printing press, right? And when you could easily make multiple copies of the same thing, scribes could copyists could copy out manuscripts in the Middle Ages, for sure. You can always make multiple copies, but for one person to copy a book takes a long time. But when you have a printing press, you can reproduce things mechanically, and man, you can churn out those copies fast. And so that made it possible to produce individualized things like this, which give rise to individualized experiences of reading. So what I want to get at here then is, notice that as you get into the news that's being reported, you're doing something very much like those people walking in the downtown street. You're kind of inhabiting that same world that everybody else inhabits. In this case, its spatial parameters are not downtown. In the case of modern newspapers, its spatial parameters are pretty much the globe, or at least if it's the local paper, it's going to be the whole city, or more likely it's going to be a national paper and it's going to tell you about Canada or the United States or France or whatever. The space you inhabit quantitatively is very big with these things, and you essentially become one of the people who inhabits that space in the same way that everybody else does, and that becomes the big indifferent space. And just to underline one thing I said before that's relevant to that point, notice again that the ability to have the experience yourself as an indifferent individual is partially made possible by the material thing, the mechanically reproduced, manufactured individual newspaper, right? Something about having that kind of material resource allows you to realize the interpretation of yourself that you might have that says, I'm an individual, right? I'm not just a family member. I'm not just another instance of that group who is defined by it and shares with all those people a sense of these things. I'm a self-defining individual. You want to think of yourself that way, maybe, and that's maybe why people want to get out of the family when they're 15. You want to think of yourself that way, but you can't. Your world doesn't automatically communicate back to you that you are such a thing, right? And so that's why you want to get out. And so when you read the newspaper, or when you go out to the nightclub, or when you walk in those downtown streets, the nightclub, the downtown streets, and the newspaper are material resources that allow you to live out that interpretation of yourself. And just, remember, I've already said this, but I'll underline it. There is such a space of the nightclub that can do that. There is such a space of the downtown street that can do that. And there is such a thing as the newspaper experience that can do that, because it's not just done by you, but all the other people involved in a way collectively endorse that, right? That's all of those people, in other words, are living both with an interpretation of themselves as individuals and an interpretation of the space as an indifferent space for individuals. And everybody has to act in the way that lets that thing happen, such that they all are able to have this experience. So that's the phenomenon I'm after when in Sites of Exposure, I talk in what I call Lesson 8, when I talk about an environment of indifference, right? I'm contrasting an environment of indifference with a home environment, which is an environment of belonging, right? An environment that's specially there for you, but this is just indifferent, right? So that's the phenomenon I'm trying to get at. But now, and that's what I talk about in Lesson 8, Part A. Now I want to move to what I talk about in Lesson 8, Part B. And that is the idea that it's indifferent, but it's only sort of indifferent, right? And so what I want to get at there is, the idea was that you were going to leave the home, which means you were going to leave that cozy, insulating world of shared expectations, and you were going to go out into the bigger world, right? Into the real world. But the point I want to make is that even when you move outside the family to that larger social world in your culture, that larger social world still operates with a kind of home-like character, right? Collectively endorsed shared expressions that make it possible for you to live that way. And or put that differently, that space of indifference beyond the family takes a different form in different cultures, such that when you participate in that aspect of your culture's life, you enact and reproduce and express a distinctive way of taking things up in a distinctive set of situations, expectations, just as you do in a regular home environment. So it's still got a character of home. And I want to give you just one image to think about this. This is a photograph of mine that I took the first time I went to India in 2011. This is in the city of Thiruvananthapuram, in the south of India, in sort of the bottom of the state of Kerala. It's a great place. But I went there. I went there from Toronto, and where I'm used to, being like those kids at the nice nightclub, or being like that guy and his wife walking downtown. I had a certain expectation, and I live with a certain expectation of what the public social world offers when you leave the home. And I went to India, and I didn't find quite that same thing. What I found, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but just a few little things. What I found was, I think I'll make 3 quick points. One, I found relatively little access to alcohol. So in Toronto, or New York or Philadelphia or wherever I go, I expect to be able to go out to a bar, and everybody else is doing that, and I expect to be able to order a drink, and I expect quite a variety of those sorts of things. And that's just sort of a regular part of life. That's kind of what I think the world outside the family is. But in India, I found very few places that served alcohol. They certainly didn't do it late. Most didn't really do it. And the ones that did were like hotels or other kinds of restaurants that actually catered to Westerners. So it's not universally true. Of course, it's possible to get liquor and so on in India, but it's just my experience in Delhi, Thiruvananthapuram, even Mumbai was that and other places was that it just was not. It's just not the same kind of thing it is. In Mumbai, like there are highly expensive and very kind of westernized areas there, that's different. But in the general culture, that's just not what happened. Point number 1. Point number 2, what I did find were places like this. This is where people would go out at night, and they would go out. So they would leave the house, but they would go out and they would have dinner in the evening, or they would sit in these places, for many hours, having extended dinners, and they were socializing, they were talking, they were having a great time, just like I would expect in other bars or other nightlife in Toronto and so on. But it was associated with eating, not drinking, and they tended to go out in family groups. So that was pretty interesting. That lots of family membership came along in that social world. And then the third thing was to the extent that I did find places that involved more of the what I think of as an open environment of indifference, an open kind of downtown where people were just out as sort of single individuals doing things in the public world. I found in India and also in Istanbul, for example, my experience was that the proportion of men to women being outside was much higher than it was here. In other words, that environment of indifference seemed to me much more culturally open to men than women. Now those are my idiosyncratic experiences from a handful of trips to India and a handful of trips to Turkey. But it really did seem to me that those 3 things characterized what I would call this public social realm beyond the family, namely the not so much alcohol, a lot more family presence, and much more accessibility to men than to women. So other people who are expert in these things can determine whether my experiences are representative or not. But my point about that is that or something like it is true between different cultures, namely that people have a culture and they bring expectations out into a public world that reflect their cultural identity, so that even when they're leaving their home world or the family behind, they're still in a sense part of a much bigger way that a culture has made a home in the world. And so even the thing that counts as what I call a relatively indifferent environment still carries with it the specific trappings of a particular culture, with the effect that it's only relatively open, right? Just as when I said about the family home, you try to be hospitable, but you're not going to let anybody and let them do anything. Well, similarly here, I said this public space is in a sense something you experience as defined by openness, but that openness is nonetheless sort of conditioned or conditional. People from some of those Indian or Turkish cultures or cities that I went to could very easily not experience themselves as welcomed in a North American public environment. They might also not feel that they welcome it. They might not feel like they want to be there. And similarly, Westerners in these environments in Istanbul or India, again, might feel like they don't really belong there. And they don't really fit. So my point being then that the issue of belonging shows up again. Even in this area that's supposed to be indifferent and open, there's still an issue of membership, right? So there I've tried to bring out the phenomenon of the environment of indifference, both why we might want it and so on, and then what form it actually takes in actual cultural life. I want to now make two points about that, and that will then set us up for our next study. So here are the points. Cultures are therefore different, right? And so even though internally they endorse this kind of goal of openness, an open environment, they aren't automatically open to each other, and there are therefore conflicts between cultures. A classic one that we hear about a lot these days is that some people raised in, let's say, Muslim cultures, people who are raised in a pretty religiously sort of orthodox or strict way may very well will have very strong views about how women should display themselves in public and how they should not. And they consequently might not think favorably about the way North American public spaces are open to women's participation. And reciprocally, people in North America or women in North America might really feel opposed to the way that one of those more traditional Muslim cultures, even in a developed 20th century society, bring with them expectations about how women should and should not, or can and cannot, enter into public spaces. And similarly, how men can behave towards women in both of those places. So these differences aren't just matters of fashion or style. These cultural differences that are often the kind of unnoticed expectations that are defining a public space in different cultures are actually fundamental matters of disagreement and conflict. And consequently, those cultures can and do involve people developing views about the other one that says that one's bad, and people fight over them. So that's then the next point I wanted to make about the conflict between cultures that is pretty much built into that idea then of the cultural specificity that I'm saying you're going to see in the environments of indifference that define different cultures. And so then the final point I want to make then is that we can't fail, therefore, in as much as we belong to a culture, we can't fail to be involved in conflicts with people in other cultures. There's no neutral way to live. So I was saying before that, establishing a home like the pioneer, is already to settle in somebody else's land, right? And so it's a kind of aggressive gesture of appropriation just to make a home. Well, and so you can't make a home without at some level enacting a kind of hostility towards someone else. Well, I'm really making the same point here about a culture. You can't be a part of a culture without at some level already having adopted a hostile attitude towards the way somebody is living somewhere else. So you might say, "Oh no, I'm open to everybody," but you can't be. It's just not a possibility. Not in any simple sense. You might like to be, but you're living in a specific way that brings with it values and expectations, exclusions and inclusions, and so on. And so the last point then that I want to make is our very participation in this social and political world, because it has conflict on the horizon all the time, even if you're sufficiently buffered that you don't notice it, right? It's nonetheless always there. The very participation in that world then brings with it the need to figure out how to deal with those conflicts. What are the norms we should have for dealing with those issues? And really, when you say I'm open to all cultures, I want to say, well, I did say you can't easily be, but in a way, that's the value that really lies behind this. How can we be inclusive when, on the other hand, the way we live is always in significant ways exclusionary and therefore oppositional? And so what I'm trying to get at then is that in our very form of political inhabitation, of politically having a home, the norm or the goal of openness or inclusivity is always there, sort of on the horizon. But any ways that we try to enact it are always sort of relative. So the question is, could there be a kind of absolute indifference? Is there a way that our openness could be not just relative but universal? So that's what I'm after, is this idea that it's in the very nature of our political experience that it sort of impels us to raise this question of an indifference that goes beyond cultural specificity, or a universality that goes beyond cultural specificity. That idea I'm really bringing out then of my lesson 8b in the book, and lesson 8c is about that notion of absolute indifference. That's what we're going to go on to, and I just want to now associate it with one word, and that is the word democracy. So I want to say that ideal of universal inclusiveness is pretty close to the ideal of democracy. So we'll come back now and talk about that. So next time I want to talk about the notion of democracy and get us into Derrida's book, and then we'll move on with that issue of basically the question of inclusion.